SoundCartel.
As retail fights for its life at one of the most challenging times in living memory, the shopping centre wars are taking hold. Will retailers flee the rigid rules of shopping centres for high street shopping strips, or disappear altogether? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. We've all become so accustomed to them, our megalithic shopping centres where so many would flock for retail therapy, in and out of specialty fashion shops, meeting for coffee with friends. It was all such fun, but times are changing, and COVID has shone a light on the fragile nature of the relationship between our shopping centres and the retail outlets they house. Business restrictions are turning into closures. Smaller retailers can't afford the rent, and the larger retail companies are now fighting back. It's a scenario that Peter Buckingham has foreshadowed for some time. Peter's demographic and mapping company, Spectrum Analysis, has drawn attention to the discrepancies between retail performance and rental increases in our shopping centres for years. And it looks like some retailers are now playing hardball, just like the shopping centre leasing agents. Question is, where will it end? And will our shopping centres ever be the same post-COVID? Peter Buckingham tells Heather Dawson the issue's been growing for a long time.
Look, over the last few years, we've produced a couple of white paper reports called Shopping Centres, The Inconvenience Truth. I guess it was a bit of a play on Al Gore's film. And I guess this has always been about how shopping centre rents have historically kept increasing irrespective of the performance of the centre as a whole. So we look at the percentage increasing of the moving annual turnover, which is something we can collect through the Property Council, and we see how that has been increasing compared to the rents that are normally requested of the tenants to pay. And as you can imagine, the increases far exceed the extra moving annual turnover that comes into the shopping centres.
Well, that's right, but it's all very timely now, Peter, as a result of COVID and the pretty devastating impact it's been having on many retailers. So now war seems to have broken out between the major shopping centres and some of the big retailers who seem to be sticking their heels in over rent. So what's going on?
Well, I guess the shopping centres have really been forced to close by our government, and especially here in Victoria, where both you and I are. And that has really caused the issue where the leasing agents and the owners of the shopping centres have wanted to keep the rents coming in because that is their main revenue and how all their investments have been worked out. And the poor old retailer hasn't had the money to do it. So we normally are finding that the specialty retailers, especially the smaller stores, the fashion, food, the coffee ones, have really been severely impacted on what they can do, let alone by how many people are actually coming into that centre. They're really hemorrhaging badly. Obviously, the shopping centre's owners just going to keep pushing to keep the rents up as best they can. To me, there's always been this big issue that as shopping centres change hands, in many cases from one property fund to another, the price keeps going up based on the so-called returns. These can be the result of some creative accountancy, as many costs of rebates, rent-free periods, etc., that may not be part of the base rent. And unfortunately, those all get used in valuing the centre. And unfortunately, many of us have shares in these shopping centres, either directly or through our super funds. So in one way, if rents are dropping, it affects most of us anyway. And I guess as the people that vote the directors onto these shopping centre boards, a lot of the very big companies and big superannuation trusts are always trying to protect ours and their position. So it becomes a double-edged sword. So with the targets on returns expected by these big shareholders, the pressure just stays on to keep up the revenues, i.e. the rentals, and the main revenue source for operating the shopping centres. So they don't want to hear about COVID and they don't want to hear about decreases.
Well, some retailers have argued that rent should be assessed by sales turnover, while the shopping centres seem to be arguing that rent should be based on profit. So who has the better argument there, Peter?
Right. Well, I think the bigger argument from a retailer's view is the unfairness of the contracts they're placed on by the shopping centres. So this all starts normally with a 5-year lease with no options, and very often very high rental increases. So the shopping centres have always taken a long-term view, not what you pay in your first 5 years, but the point of rent and lease renegotiation at the end of that first period, when your sunk costs are still really high and it's very hard to leave or move out. So you get forced to accept their often crippling rents. The point is the government has really allowed over many years shopping centre owners to force these 5-year basic lease terms with no options. 20, 30 years ago, you'd get a lease and you'd have options to take up the next period. Now you don't. And if you go into a shopping strip, you'll normally get whatever the lease period and options you require. So it makes it a lot more attractive. Now, retailers have good memories, and the likes of Solly Lou feel they've been persecuted for years by the big shopping centres. And now really they're hitting back, and they're hitting back hard.
Well, it's hard not to feel sorry for the smaller retailers in shopping centres who don't have the reserves to fight their landlords. So where do they stand if the bigger retailers, as they're threatening to move out, taking foot traffic with them? Because that would leave them in a dire position, wouldn't it? So what are your thoughts there, Peter?
Well, the government has brought through legislation to assist in these arguments. However, I see many shopping centre owners are playing hardball, and they're not negotiating in the spirit of the long-term solution. The Western Australian government just put an extension of another 6 months onto their law that they've now brought in that says they have to be supposedly negotiating in good, fair view, but we're waiting to see how that goes. I do accept some retailers may be painting a pessimistic view, but the longer-term situation will be when smaller and less popular shopping centres may be trying to be reopened and get back to post-CV-19 levels, but they're going to have 20 or 30% less tenants. So I guess we'll see what the market forces bring about with that.
Well, crystal ball, will the big shopping centre landlords win, do you think? Or are we likely to see very different looking shopping centres when COVID finally ends?
Well, I think shopping centres will be very different post-COVID. Many of the stronger retailers, such as Solly Lou with his Premier Investment Group, have basically used this opportunity to declare war on the shopping centre owners. And this has been coming for some time. Premier, which owned things like Smiggle, Peter Alexander, Just Jeans, Doty, Portmans, have basically refused to pay rent, while stores in Australia and overseas were closed for about 2 months for the coronavirus lockdown. And Mr. Lou has demanded that future rents be based on percentage sales. The other side of this is he's been claiming JobKeeper for around 12,000 staff and recently announced record profits. The issue of whether they go to percentage rents or the way we are at the moment where we have a negotiation and then have a base rent is something Solly Lou's been on about for years, but I guess his view of percentage rents will be something between 1 and 5, if not less, percent, and probably the shopping centres are going to be for sort of 10% plus or a number up near there. So there'll be a very big amount of gap in between, but he has a view which says we should be able to do it. Our rent should be a percentage of our sales and not a fixed cost. So long way to go on that one.
Well, Peter, I remember you saying a while ago now that you could see a lot more food places in shopping centres, restaurants maybe. We've got the hotel down in Chadstone, for example. Is that where shopping centres could be heading rather than fashion outlets these days?
Look, I totally believe the inside of shopping centres have been changing dramatically for some years. A classic case of that is we did a job at Forest Hill Chase some years ago and I recorded how many cafes there were there and how big each cafe was. And I had to go back recently, a year or two ago, and I think that original job was around 2007. And in those days there was about 6 cafes because Forest Hill has not changed, and the average seating was about 25. We went back this last time, I think there was now 8 cafes, and the average seating was about 70 or 80 seats per cafe. So what's in my view has happened is a lot of small, especially the small clothing type shops have really disappeared. Now they've been driven out by the likes of Zara and these other big groups where you can buy a t-shirt for $10 and they've left the market. Now the shopping centre owners had to try and find, well, what can we put in its place? And it tends to me that they've gone towards either alfresco type centres, which is say like Knox Ozone, or if you're in Sydney, you're seeing these around all the big shopping centres where you have a theatre group and then a whole lot of restaurants around it. And they've used that for some of the space. And then the other spaces have basically gone into food. Well, we can only eat so much. At the end of the day, there's only 25 million Australians, so we can only eat so many kilograms of food. So as much as they've tried to train people to come and buy their food more and more, eating in these shopping centres, it really has been a huge change of type from what many years ago was probably a big percentage of, I guess, clothing and specialty smaller stores have now all been replaced by, firstly, your Kmarts and these type of stores, no doubt about that. But secondly, by these international ones that come and go, like Zara, and I think Topshop's come and already gone, so it didn't even last that long. H&M, and they really do knock the stuffing out of the small stores.
Well, your business offers strategic directions for businesses seeking the right locations for their operations. What are you advising your retail clients, Peter? Because between shopping centre landlords and declining strip shopping precincts, the choices are getting a bit tricky, aren't they?
I personally feel that strips do offer at least a more stable and less risky option. As the owners are individuals in many cases of these shops in the strips, the negotiation is much more on an equal platform because they have to do a longer term view in mind, as often their store, the store they own, is really just their personal superannuation. So your negotiation is a much more even approach than one into the shopping centres with some young shopping centre executive, leasing executive who's trying to cut his teeth and prove to his boss that he can get more money out of it than anyone else has ever got before. I feel some of the issues with shopping centres rest back on the demands placed upon the leasing agents to meet these targets. And historically there's been little empathy with the business other than to get them out and someone else in who'll pay the rent. Those days may be past, as I would expect the pool of smaller retailers to be drying up. And if they are determined to open, they'd probably be nervous of the sharp shopping centre leasing executives that they're going to come across. Supply and demand may force the shopping centres to rethink the way they treat tenants. However, this has not been the case for many years now.
But times might be changing.
Yeah, times might be changing. Let's see where it all goes.
That was Peter Buckingham, Managing Director of mapping and demographic company Spectrum Analysis. Business Essentials Daily is a SoundCartel podcast. Executive producer is Heather Dawson. Producers are Nick Schilberger, Chris Ashmore, and myself. Technical production by Pete Letts and Belinda Trimboli. I'm Nicole Goodman. Thanks for listening. We'll bring you more B Daily next week.
Sound.